And despite projections that Nigeria's inflation rate for the month of February will record a decline 20.96% from the 21.82% it recorded in January. Latest figure from the National Bureau of Statistics shows that inflation rate for February 2023 climbed to new 17-year high of 21.91%, representing 0.09 points. According to the Consumer Price Index report, the rise in inflation rate is as a result of the significant cash crunch experienced across the country, occasioned by the Naira redesign policy of the Central Bank of Nigeria and uncertainties relating to recently held presidential election. This latest development shows that the second consecutive hike in inflation for the year 2023 is actually also taken into cognizance. Let's talk this through by talking with joining me now live visually to do some analysis of these projected figures as we await the MDAs report is an Economist and Tax Manager at PricewaterhouseCoopers, PwC, Mr. Abiodun Kayode-Alli. Thank you so much for joining us on the Business Show. Nigeria's inflation rate for the second consecutive month is seeing an increase. This is 0.9% point increment from when compared to the 21.82% recorded in previous month. What do you think are the factors driving this upward trend?
All right, thanks for having me, Ibrahim. Like you pointed out at the earlier stage, at the introduction, the causes basically, apart from structural issues that we've had, another additional cost that we can see has to do with the Naira redesign policy that actually took place. So if you look at those things that were actually heightened, those items that were heightened, food inflation represented a major percentage of that increase, right? Food inflation went from about 24.32% to 24.35%. You might say the increase is marginal, but all the same, it's still high, right? So if you think about it, a lot of traders were struggling to even accept the use of ATM, the POS devices, right? And for those who didn't have cash, you had to use alternative channels in making payments. And the alternative channels we're referring to here are e-payments. And we understand that most of these banks were struggling under the pressure of their electronic banking platform, right? So I think this was an additional cost to that increase, aside the normal structural causes that we have, such as the impact of the war in Europe, which is actually impacting on imported inflation. Because if you look at that figure that we're actually presenting, majority of the inflation that we experience is coming as a result of our need for imported items, which was in producing things here, right? In manufacturing things. Is it your bread? Is it your cereals, right? A lot of these items, we import them, right? So you have that pass-through effect, right, as a result of the impact of exchange rates feeding into your inflation. So we already have that. Then also we have issues that have not yet been fully addressed. I'm sure you remember back in October, November, we had the issue of flooding, right, which impacted on the food basket regions, right? Regions in the middle, in the northern belt, right? So most of these things are still there. Now we've added the issue of the Naira redesign policy. All these factors, you can see them taking effect in terms of the food prices that we've seen and general inflation that we've seen.
Absolutely. Too many issues there for Nigerians to actually grapple with, to deal with. But then how do you think these inflation figures might impact on Nigerian businesses operating within the country, particularly those operating in sectors like you mentioned, manufacturing, and then retail and finance, both in the short term and, of course, long term?
Yeah, thanks. That's a very good question. So generally, inflation is never good for anyone, right? If you look at all the economic agents, right, from individuals to businesses and even government itself, it's never a good thing for anyone. For the individuals, what it's simply doing is that it's reducing your purchasing power, right? Minimum wage has been 30,000 naira for a very long time, and even some states struggle to pay this minimum wage, right? And it's not like we're in a situation whereby workers have that huge power to demand a pay rise. So they still have their pay, their salaries intact, and yet they have to they have to manage and they have to bear all these increases. So it's never a good thing. It reduces their purchasing power for businesses as well, right? Apart from the fact that if you look at some of the other components that increased, apart from food, which I actually dwelt on initially, if you look at things like energy, like you mentioned as well, energy cost actually went up. So all these things actually impact on the cost of doing business, right, for a lot of producers. And one other thing you're going to see that is going to translate as a result of this heightened increase in prices is that it's going to slowly translate into employment. Nigeria has one of the highest unemployment rates in the world at 33%. So when businesses struggle with respect to their cost of production, right, what you then see is that they begin to lay off workers, they begin to lay off staff, and that kind of puts us back in that vicious cycle. For the government itself, government is not going to find it easy at this point in time, because if you think about it, look at the budget, for instance. A lot of things have gone into that budget projection, the 21.8 trillion projection that was done by government for 2023. It had its inflation target, I think, somewhere around 17%, if I still remember. Now we're dealing with something around the range of 24%. So that means that there's going to be a lot more that will be required in getting the job done. So both in the short run, it's not good, considering what we're going through right now. And even in the long run, it kind of distorts planning, right? It kind of distorts planning. So a lot of people will then need to try to get much more money than they initially bargained for when it comes to projects, both from the business, from the government, and even from the individual angle. So the long and short of it is that inflation generally, it's not a good thing or a desirable thing for any economy.
It's not the best of times for people to actually hear some of these analyses that you're actually putting forth. But then, still talking about the people whose reasons all of these things are happening. So how are Nigerian consumers reacting to the rising inflation figures, and how do you think this might impact their spending habits and overall purchasing power?
Yeah, so Nigerians, one thing I'll say about Nigerians is that Nigerians have been known to be very resilient, right? Nigerians have been known to be very resilient. We've had this issue before now. Like you said in your introduction, it's a 17-year high, right? This is something that we've had right from the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic in 2020 up till the Russia-Ukraine war, which took place last year, February, right? So how are Nigerians reacting? Well, at this point in time, a lot of Nigerians, with the impact of the cash crunch, a lot of Nigerians have had to kind of change the rate at which they consume items. Now, if you think about it, food items actually it takes a huge chunk of the salaries and wages of Nigerians. So you've seen lots of Nigerians have to do without some particular items, right? If you look at food items such as fruits, is it apples you want it, or are you referring to other fruits like carrots, right? You've seen a lot of Nigerians do away with these things and focus only on main food such as rice, which is actually the main staple food in Nigeria. So you've seen a lot of people even change their feeding formula, some going without meals for some period of time. So we've seen lots of these situations. We've also seen situations where Nigerians have begun to get things on credits, right, as a result of cash not being available in the instant time. So there has been that modification, right? And if you look at companies, for instance, a lot of companies have decided to give their employees the opportunity to work from home. Also, and this is simply as a result of both the cash crunch and also the fuel scarcity issue, which is still lingering till now, right? So businesses, individuals, they've begun to change the way at which they live, the way they will consume things, and the way they do business, right? So everyone is coming up with new strategies. But the honest truth is that how long can they continue to do this thing, and does it help productivity? Because one thing we must say is that the impact of this cash crunch, the Naira redesign, has also impacted on productivity, whereby instead of people going about their daily business, going about their productive activities, they are still spending long times on the queues, right? They are taking time on the queues. And we are thankful that the CBN has actually announced that you can still spend the old Naira notes. So this, to a reasonable extent, will also help in alleviating the suffering of Nigerians currently.
It's actually
those are my few thoughts.
Right. It's actually a very good thing for the CBN to have come out the time they came out so that they don't stretch Nigerians beyond their tensile limits. But then, despite several policies by the CBN to tame rising inflation, the monster still keeps rising. So in your opinion, what more can the fiscal and monetary authorities do to cushion the current inflation rate and stabilize prices?
Yeah, thanks. Thanks a lot for that, Ibrahim. And it's good you pointed out that it's not something that the monetary authority can deal with on its own. The fiscal authority needs to work hand in hand in addressing this issue. So from my point of view, one key thing, like I said, one key thing that is mainly responsible for the inflation we experience in the country has to do with imported inflation, a lot of the things that we consume being imported, right? So over time, I think one key thing that is important is that Nigeria begins to go into production and consumption of its own produce, right? We begin to consume what we produce. That's very key. And I think one other key thing that is quite important, which is also the reason for that high food inflation, has to do with insecurity, right? Insecurity is a big thing. Once we're able to tackle the issue of insecurity, which is actually quite prevalent in the northern part of the country, if we're able to tackle it to a reasonable extent, it gives farmers that comfort to be able to go to their farms, right? We've heard of recent killings going on in the northern region, right? So that's a key thing that needs to be tackled. Then another key thing that needs to be tackled, the main driver of the inflation, if you look at the news report that was put by the National Bureau of Statistics, the main driver has to do with food inflation. So it's all about how can we feed ourselves. I do agree with you that the central bank has come up with lots of policies to aid farmers. There is another argument about how many of these rural farmers that actually go into the production, how many of them actually gain access by the CBN to go into advanced or mechanized farming. I think that's a very key thing that will help Nigeria. A lot of nations, advanced economies, they are into mechanized farming. They're able to feed not only themselves, they're also able to feed the world, right? But we are still struggling with feeding ourselves. And only recently, we've had situations whereby companies are beginning to consider importing tomato, right? Because we experience a lot of post-harvest losses. By the time these crops and products are being farmed, by the time they're being harvested, they spoil at that point in time before they are being distributed from where they are produced to other regions of the country, right? So a lot needs to go into advanced and mechanized farming, right? As well as a lot needs to go into storage and transportation. I still said earlier that we're still dealing with a lot of issues with respect to distribution channels, supply channels, right? Even our road networks. A lot of issues we need to deal with that. So these are some of the quick things that we need to do. Not just the monetary side, because the monetary side have done a lot in raising rates to curtail the current inflation, but it's not been working, right? It might work in advanced economies, but Nigeria's case is peculiar. We are not driven by a supply side inflation, rather a demand side. So I think the fiscal authority needs to work hand in hand with the monetary authority here, and a lot more needs to be done from the fiscal side. And it's expected that the new administration that will be coming in May will be thinking about these things, because it's part of the things that I've actually seen in their plan during their presentation of their manifestos.
I love the fact that you actually, talked about the new administration. We'll look at what you think they would need to do more and explore more. But then I want you to expand on the impact of these on Nigerian businesses and how they are currently, how they are adapting to the current inflation environment to maintain, growth and profitability. And what strategies do you think you like to advise them for them to adopt to mitigate the impact on their operations?
Yeah, for businesses, businesses haven't had it easy, and that's why I just had to commend them and talk about their resilience earlier on. So if you look at most of the things, right? So we're talking about increasing output, increasing production. As long as you have enough output to be able to supply demand, you will be able to reduce the impact of that inflation. But then let's look at the input of businesses. Most of these businesses, their input has to do with, because we have issues that have to do with infrastructure challenges, right? Most of them, their input has to do with them trying to power their businesses. using diesel, if not diesel, using petrol, right, due to the epileptic energy supply that we have in the country, right? So most of these businesses, one key thing that we then see is that most of these businesses can find alternative power channels, such as going on solar. But even solar itself is an investment in itself, right? So from that angle of power, they experience huge costs. You pick up the financial statements of any of these companies, right, and you see that their operating expenses in terms of power is actually quite high. The only thing I can say for them is to consider alternative sources of power in that regards. Then the next thing they can then do has to do with scaling down on other input costs, right? And one of the good examples I've given is the fact that most of these business would then begin to think about probably considering their staff work from home. I know in the manufacturing sector, you can't get staff to work from home, right? When it comes to manufacturing, what a lot of businesses are doing right now is that they're actually laying off workers. Some are laying off workers due to the loss, right? And their business not being profitable any longer. One thing I would say simply is if they can consider probably investing in equipment, right, in machines, right? Because sometimes in this technology age, you can get things done faster with the aid of equipment. Although this also has another problem in its own in terms of unemployment. But I think investment in machines and equipment can also help in these current times, and a huge investment in the power. You just can't let go of that power, because that cost is a huge cost to businesses in Nigeria in this present moment. And to be quite honest with you, what a lot of businesses would need right now would be a massive investment in infrastructure by the government, really. The government can do that. It can also work hand in hand with the private sector, right? We've seen different initiatives that have been put out, such as the initiative with respect to roads, right? You've heard about this road infrastructure tax credit scheme, which the government has introduced to kind of bring in the private sector to help in funding most of this infrastructure. So I think, and in doing this, the government is also giving tax credits to most of this private sector. So I think government can work hand in hand along with this business to provide more infrastructure and also bring in the private sector to invest in infrastructure and also give some sort of waivers, tax credits. I think the government can do beyond what it's doing in terms of road, extend it to other infrastructure. I think some of these things would be a win-win for the entire Nigerian economy.
Right. So very quickly, looking ahead, what are your predictions for the future of inflation in Nigeria and how businesses should prepare for these changes, as we look towards the incoming administration, though it's just few weeks to come?
Yeah, so my prediction, if you consider most of the things that has been said by the president-elect when he was campaigning, he talked about removal of subsidy, right? So my expectation is that with the removal of that subsidy, there will be to some extent, a further increase in prices, right, at the short term, during the short term. So I see inflation still going a bit higher, but I think on average throughout the year 2023, we should be expecting it to still stay within the 20%, right, the lower band of the 20% for the year. And what should businesses do? Like I said, businesses now need to begin to invest in technology, right? Invest in alternative power distribution channels, right? So I think that kind of investment would help, right? And what I would just simply say is that most of these private sectors, they need to try and have meetings with the government with respect to expectation and trying to get government to assist at this point in time, because I see tough times ahead, but I believe with collaboration with government, businesses will be able to weather the storm. That's what I see, basically.
So we continue to talk about all of these things and monitor the figures as they come out, as they emerge, whether they're going to come down, decline, or rise. But we keep talking about it and see how we can draw the attention of those in authorities to make sure they do the right policies, and some of which you've suggested. But then we'll say thank you to you, an economist and tax manager at PricewaterhouseCoopers, Abiodun Kayode-Alli. Thank you so much for your keenness of insight. Thank you.